Thank you, Julian. What a guy. I don't know how come I never got here. I used to live over here in Cleveland, but I guess I left Cleveland just shortly after this conference began. I moved south about 12 years ago. But here I am, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much. As Julian says, he better get off and let me get on with this because he knows. I was told to limit my talk tonight, so I will just spend the first hour and a half talking about myself. The second hour, I'll talk about the program. It's certainly wonderful to see a crowd like this gathered together, and you look so grand out there. I wish everyone could see you from this vantage point. Anytime I see a good-looking bunch like this together, it always reminds me of a story. I'm not too much of a storyteller, but this one story I do like, and this always reminds me of it. It's about Jerry, the town drunk. Maybe some of you folks have heard this story. This Jerry, he had never been seen sober many, many years. He was drunk all the time. And Jerry he always had a dirty beard. He never had a haircut. He was filthy. His bare feet were on the ground. There's holes in his britches, and he stunk. This was normal for Jerry. He always drunk. Time went on, many years went on, and finally Jerry turned up his toes and died. And this presented a problem in the town. They had to bury him. He had no one who would claim him. So the town had to get together, and they got an undertaker who furnished a casket and got him a new suit and shaved him up and cleaned him up real nice. And they got him prepared for burial. Then they had to get a preacher to take care of the funeral sermon. It was kind of a tough job to get a preacher to do this job. Finally they got one. And this preacher, he came up there to give the funeral sermon, oration, and he was stumped. He just didn't know quite what to say. So he says, well, folks, he says, I admit, I just don't know what to say about Jerry. You all knew him. We all knew him here. We knew him for what he was. He says, but I'd just like you all to do one thing. He says, I'd like you all to come up here and take a good look at Jerry and see how good he looks since he quit drinking. I think this happens to all of us in a more or less degree. I'm glad we all didn't have to die to get this compliment. People change very quickly in AA when they come here. I think every person here is a miracle, every one of us. I know in my case it had to be a miracle that I ever arrived here. I'd like to tell you just how I did get into this fellowship. As Julian mentioned, I had my 25th anniversary last February. And at that time, there was no AA. This is the way we do things. Everything starts backwards. This was not known as AA in those days. And yet I got in it, see. No AA, but I got in it. I was on the bum, and I was having trouble at home, and my wife was giving me my last chance to make good at home. And this was on the premise that I should go to work for her brother, bless his heart. This was quite a family I was mixed up with in those days. This is not the wife I have now, I might say without, I won't have to mention that. He drove a truck. He had a truck that ran between Cleveland and New York. And they told me that if I would take a job as his assistant and learn how to drive this truck, that I could prove to them that I wasn't this drunken so-and-so that they were all calling me and accusing me of being. Why, they'd give me another chance at home. So there's nothing I could do but accept this challenge. Now, I'm a fellow who does not believe in work. I never did. And getting sober hasn't changed this very much either. But the idea of driving one of those big outfits was really out of this world. But I had to go ahead with this deal. So I told him I would, so away we went. This was in the fall of the year. And we headed for New York. I didn't arrive in New York sober. I got away from him in Albany. And I remember this. I remembered that Albany was the capital of New York, and I suddenly developed a keen desire to see the government buildings. He had to take a nap that evening, so I got out and got away from him. And you know what happened. But I got back, and he was sleeping on the seat there, and I stepped on the poor boy's face getting up into the sleeping part of the cab, and he knew what was wrong. He carried me on to New York and threw me out on the waterfront, and there I was. Well, I had no money, I had no clothes, I had no nothing. But I had a sister-in-law, another sister of his, bless her heart, in Yonkers. And she used to think I was pretty good. She always used to refer to me as her favorite brother-in-law. This was some time before this, however. And I went out to see Virginia, thought maybe she'd look after me. Here I was in a town of 7 or 8 million people, and I didn't know a soul. I made my way out to Yonkers, and I remembered I'd gone there on my honeymoon when we first gotten married, so I knew that she lived way up on top of a hill. When I got out there, I didn't go up on a hill, I went down a hill and got in this Italian section down there. And I met some very nice people, and they were drinking wine. And you know what happened. By the time I got up to Virginia's place, I was really potted. I was boiled. And I can only remember one thing about this trip to Virginia's house. I was rolling around on the floor with her 2 kids. She didn't like this. She took a dim view of this, and she put me in the back of her car and drove me down to that waterfront and dumped me out where her brother had dumped me. So I was in New York without a dime, without a friend, without anything, period. And a winter sitting in. I don't know how long I stayed in New York. It's not important, but I existed there a long, long time. I tell this story for this reason, that eventually this played a big part in my coming into AA. It seems that sometime later, Virginia had her doctor over about one of the kids, and they got to talking about drinking. And she told this doctor about this drunken brother-in-law of hers and what a nice guy he used to be and what a slob he is now. And the doctor says, you know, that's odd. He says, I used to have a drunken brother-in-law like that too. But he met some cult or other, and they do nothing but, he does nothing but run around fixing drunks. And besides this brother-in-law, there's a doctor down in Akron, Ohio, who's in this strange cult, and he spends all his time doing this. And this doctor suggested that if I should ever land back in Cleveland, maybe they could send me to this doctor down there, and maybe he could fix me. Well, he was referring to Dr. Smith, Dr. Bob, Doc Smith in Akron. This doctor Virginia was talking to happened to be Dr. Leonard Strong, who is Bill Wilson's brother-in-law. Now, at that time, there was no AA. There were probably a half a dozen, 6, 8, 10 people had ever been exposed to this plan through the old Oxford group. Sometime later, I got back to Cleveland. I got a ride back with another truck driver. And he took me to Erie, and from Erie I beat my way in, and I got back home, and I tried to get in the nest, but it didn't work. The little woman met me at the door, and she was pleasant enough so long as I was outside. And she told me about this doctor in Akron, Ohio, and asked me if I'd like to go down and see him. So what could I lose? Sure, I'll go down and see him. So she bought me a one-way bus ticket, put me on a bus and sent me to Akron. And this was my first meeting with Doc Smith. Now, the first time I went down there, I got down there very early in the morning. And it was a winter time. Everything happens to me in zero weather. I don't know why this is. It's always lousy weather when anything happens to me. And I got into this Second National Bank building in Akron. I went up to the floor where Doc's office was, and he wasn't in. And I can recall, I was afraid to leave the building. It was warm in there, but I was afraid to get out if I'd never get back again. So I stayed there, and I paraded up and down in front of that lobby in front of his door for what seemed an awful long time. And I was wondering what this doctor was going to do to me and what about him and so forth and so on. I was all shaky. I was sick. I hadn't had a drink that morning. And I can remember every time I walked past his office door there, I'd read his name on the door. It says, Dr. Robert Holbrook Smith, rectal surgeon. This is the guy that's going to fix me. Well, you know, by the time you arrive at the place in your drinking career that I was at that time, you're ready for anything. And this, in my fogged up way, didn't seem unreasonable. Finally, Doc came in, and he ushered me through a couple offices into his back room. And I was prepared to tell him all about my symptoms and my troubles, but he didn't allow me to do this. He took the ball away from me, and he told me all about himself, and all about, which actually was my story. And I figured he was talking about me all the time. And I couldn't figure out how this guy knew so much about me. I'd never seen him before. And I got suspicious. Now, there are people here from Cleveland. They may remember this. Some of the older people from Cleveland that are older in years. At that time, they were having what they called the torso murder mysteries in Cleveland. They were finding bits of bodies wrapped in newspaper over in Kingsbury Run. And they never identified any of these bodies except finally one. There was a woman they found. There were 7 or 8 men's bodies that they found all cut up. But they identified this woman because there were fingerprints. It was the only woman that was involved in the deal. But she had fingerprints. She'd had a police record. But these men they never identified. And the newspapers at that time assumed that they called him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, whoever this character was. They figured he was either a butcher or a doctor that had gone berserk. And the reason they figured out, because he knew a lot about anatomy. He had a good technique in cutting up these bodies. He was doing this for kicks. And this doctor, knowing so much about me, he was all for putting me in a goonie roost out in Cuyahoga Falls where he, as he explained, people couldn't get to me. Well, about this time, this was going through my head, and I was all for people getting to me. So I up and beat it on him. I saw my chance, and I ran out of his office and beat it and disappeared. But you know, I could never forget this man. Something happened to me. And sometime later, I was sitting there in a bottle gang. I was with a bunch of jugheads I used to drink with, and we got talking about one of our favorite subjects. I think I started at this time. We got talking about quitting drinking. And this was a high spot in my drinking career, this particular get-together, this little tete-a-tete we had. As I remember, I brought this thing out. I told him that I was going to quit drinking. And this evoked a lot of response. One blabbermouth fella in particular. And now remember, we're all drunk. This is the kettle calling the pot black and so forth. This one blabbermouth, he says, you'll never quit drinking. He says, you don't have guts enough to quit drinking. I says, I'll show you. I know a doctor down in Akron will fix me. He says, nobody can fix me. You're no good. He says, quit drinking, he says, takes determination. He says, to have determination, you need a chin. He says, you got a chin like Andy Gump. You're no good. I says, I'll show you. And you know, I think this was the last vestige of pride that I had left in me. I had to do something about it. So I got a hold of someone's phone. If I live to be 1,000, I'll probably never find out whose it was. But someone got a fine phone bill because all these calls to Akron are long distance. And I don't know whose phone it was because we didn't have phones where we were. But somebody got a swell bill because Doc told me I called him numerous times that day. I only remember calling him once. But he told me to meet him at Akron City Hospital in the morning, and I did. I made it down there. And that was my beginning of this way of life. Now, things were quite a bit different in those days than they are now.